Well, I guess maybe we've already had, in fact, a number of people have come in and stated their requests for appropriations for next year. And we are going to be hearing over the next couple of days from various members of the administration with the requests for their departments that relate to the work that we do. So this morning we have Commissioner Goldstein in from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development,
Correct.
who we haven't met before. So welcome, and we'll just let you know who we are and then let you tell us about yourself.
That'll be great.
And then get into the budget. So I'm David Durfee. We did meet earlier, but I represent Shaftesbury, Glastonbury, and Sunderland down in Bennington County.
Right.
Representative Ronnie Graham, Orange 3, which is Williamstown and Chelsea.
Yeah, represent Jed Lipsky from Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Henry Pearl, represent the towns of Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Charles Wilson, I represent Caledonia 3, which is Sheffield, Sutton, and Newark.
And I'm David Templeman, Barton, Brownington, Westmore.
Josie Levitt, Grandel Chittenden, which is all of Grandel County and West Milton.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Okay.
John O'Brien, I represent Royalton in my hometown.
Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
Heather Supernaut, Windsor 4, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
Wonderful. I'm pleased to meet everybody. I'm Joan Goldstein, Department of Economic Development Commissioner. I formerly lived in Royalton, so I'm familiar your name. I've been at the agency as commissioner for, it'll be 8 years in April. I was appointed by Governor Shumlin, reappointed by Governor Scott several times. Really don't think I've ever been before House Agriculture, so this is great. Tell you a little bit about what we do and what we get involved in. My department is Department of Economic Development. There's a Department of Tourism, and there's also a Department of Housing and Community Development. And so the object of what we do is all about creating opportunities for Vermonters, and that takes the place primarily of ensuring that we have a steady state of creation of business, retention of business, expansion, and in some cases, recruitment of business. And we do that with a number of different programs. We have one is an incentive program. Another is workforce development programs where businesses train their employees and we help, pay the freight of that. Since COVID, we've had significant sums of money to help businesses recover from the pandemic. Mainly that was short-term type operating expense. And now we're more engaged in longer term or capital investment type activities that happened over the last 2 sessions. The budget before us this year in the governor's proposal, we have asked for, and I guess the reason why I'm here, you're asking specifically about the $10 million one-time ask for the building fund. I think we're calling it the Rural and Industrial Building Fund. We also have other one-time asks that have to do with brownfield remediation, new worker incentive, as well as, there's another one I'm forgetting right now, but I'll focus primarily on the industrial development. So we work in tandem with regional development corporations. They're located all over the state. There are 12 of them, and they work very closely with the regional planning commissions. And together, the idea is how they could represent not just the state in terms of, there are all these state programs. How do we make sure these programs reach the end business or entity that needs help? But they really do act as our eyes and ears because everything is local, right? We won't know from Montpelier what's happening in different parts of the state if we didn't have regional kind of boots on the ground, eyes and ears, arms and legs, what have you. So they have the ability to buy property and develop it into either industrial parks or a single industrial building. And there are mechanisms at the Vermont Economic Development Authority, VEDA, to help make that happen. And the tools that are available are generally not available to the general sort of commercial establishment. I'll give you an example. A regional development corporation could fund up to 90% of an appraisal value on a building And the 10% down could come from a tenant that needs to go in that building, and that financing could be at prime less. So this is unheard of in the commercial market. So it's a very good mechanism. And the idea behind it was to foment kind of industrial development. Why? Because most of our economy is not the private sector. Our largest employer is the government. Our largest employer after that is healthcare and education. These are all great services, but it's not private sector generating the revenue that we need to help fund the whole state's operations. So that's why that exists. And over the years, it's been used very, very, very good effect. So way back when in the 50s, when IBM were going to come up to Vermont, they utilized this type of mechanism. GBIC did. Anyway, what we're finding after saying all of that is that as we recruit, and we recruit mainly from Canada, that's our number one recruitment field. We don't go to other states and try to steal business. It's just not what we're set up to do. We don't have that capacity, nor do we have the ability to absorb like 1,000 jobs at once. Really what we're good at is sort of smaller businesses that need a foothold in the United States in order to grow an American presence and sometimes to take advantage of the US government contracts. So we've been successful at doing that, and we're increasing that. We hired a Montreal rep, and we're finding that there is quite a pipeline of people interested. So what we have found during this process, in addition to the recruitment angle, is the RDCs around the state are telling us about existing businesses in their regions that need to grow and we need space to accommodate that growth. And we just don't have existing industrial space. There are some exceptions to that. In Bennington, there are quite a few industrial buildings going unused. But generally speaking, around the state, there are about 4 or 5 regions in particular, it's extremely tight. And so what does that mean? What that means is it puts Vermont into a vulnerability. We talk to a Canadian prospect, they say they want to grow. They are interested in Vermont. They need 50,000 square feet, or they need at least a smaller amount to begin with to grow into 50,000 square feet. And they have a timeline in which to do it. And we look around the state and they want to be close to the Canadian border. They want to be able to commute to and from Quebec in a day. And we have nothing to show them. We tell them we could build a building, but with permitting and construction and all the rest of it, you're talking about close to a 3-year timeline. So this creates a vulnerability for us. And the thought process was, let's get a pot of funding that we can make available to the regional development corporations so that they could apply to get either land so that they could either get it permitted or get it started on the permitting schedule, bring infrastructure to it so that it's even more ready. Or in some cases, they may have the land and it's permitted infrastructure, but they don't have the tenant fully picked out yet. So could we utilize VITA's they call it sub 3, and some of this money that we could get from this one-time appropriation to help start that process so that the timeline isn't a 3-year timeline and we risk losing not only the new recruits from Canada, but also the existing businesses that have growth needs. It's particularly acute in the Brattleboro area, some parts of the Northeast Kingdom, Franklin County, there's some key areas. Of course, Chittenden, forget it, there's so much. The vacancy rate is like below 0.5%. It's really unhealthy, right? So that's the purpose behind the $10 million ask. And I think I'll leave it at that and answer questions or go on to other asks, whatever the pleasure of the committee is.
See what questions we may have. Representative Levitt.
Can you talk a little bit about any plans or anything you've done in Grand Isle County? Because we are right on the Canadian border.
Right. So there's a couple of things going on. For a manufacturing facility to come into play, there needs to be some infrastructure there. And I know that infrastructure is a challenge. We toured over the summer and there was a housing development that just went up in Grand Isle, and it took a long time for them to find that site where there was actually an opportunity to bring it. That continues to be a problem in that county. So if it's manufacturing, that might be tough. So I have not heard of any particular available space there. If there is a movement that you do want it there, then we'd have to really talk about where would water, wastewater
Right.
be allowed and available. Anybody who does a development outside of a town water, wastewater infrastructure is up for a really long road, right? They're gonna have to do a system. If it serves more than 25, it's considered a community system. And they are actually become like a water company. And it's really, really hard. I mean, we're working with a childcare entity in Washington County, and they are going through all that right now. So no matter how small of an operation you are, you're going through it as if you're this huge wastewater and water operator. So town water, wastewater infrastructure is key. And I know in some areas of the state that's harder.
They don't even.
It's not just money.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of, does the soil, you know, is there capacity? Is there any way to bring it? So having said that, we're open to entertaining whatever is in the realm of the
Not a lot
possible.
of infrastructure in Grand Isle County,
No.
yeah,
No.
okay.
Representative Cole.
So this appropriation would be split, maybe if I'm understanding correctly, between like water infrastructure projects as well as the actual building spaces, industrial spaces.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Not necessarily. There's other money pots available for the wastewater infrastructure. A&R has funding through ARPA. We actually have a community recovery revitalization program that we're working through now that we could fund a municipality who wants to bring water, wastewater. It has to be connected to either a housing project or an economic development project. So we haven't really thought about this 10 million to also be infrastructure. It's just, we'd want to line up with the other avenues. We have other asks throughout this House about organizing to allow towns to create TIF districts, like a single project, not this enormous sort of Burlington TIF district or anything like that, but let's say it's Grand Isle, they want to do a TIF, we call it project-based TIF. You have a project, you want to do a bond vote, you want to bring something to the town. That TIF district would allow you to do that project base, and that's working its way in different committees right now. But no, the intent was really about property and property development.
Representative Lipson.
The two questions, thank you. You know, I'm interested how Vermont or your clients are doing compared to competing with New York State, which really in the North Country has huge programs and
Yeah,
so that's the first part of the question. What are businesses, why are people attracted to Vermont despite these hurdles over
right.
accessible in North Country?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that, thank you for the question. I think that's a great question. We can't compete with New York State if we're going to talk about incentive to incentive. Like, we don't have $1 gazillion. We don't have that large ass. And so we don't compete on money alone. We do have an incentive program. And for some businesses, that's enough. Just the show of state commitment, that the state is at the table, that the state welcomes this. What we do find, and which is harder to compete with, is the readiness of the facility. And Plattsburgh, and a lot of times this is done throughout the country, it's done at the local level. So Plattsburgh had ready buildings. You know, Beta, they went to St. Albans for this other facility. They were looking in Plattsburgh. It's where they do a lot of their liftoff from. And Plattsburgh had ready-made buildings. Really hard to compete with. If we didn't find a ready-made building in St. Albans, I'm not sure we would have been able to retain that project. So that is really the genesis of this idea about, all right, how do we encourage and incentivize the local development corporations to do this, to develop the property, to start getting some ready-made buildings so that we could continue not just with the recruitment, but with the existing business base we have, which is really the predominant user of our incentive program, are our existing businesses that are expanding. And they have options all over, not just New York, but New Hampshire, sometimes in the South, you know, because we're up against it. And some of the Canadians want to be in Vermont. There's a great corridor of sort of subcontractors in the aerospace industry from Connecticut up through Quebec. And so Vermont is a logical stopping place. And we have some examples where that's really worked well. They also get attention from us. They're not going to meet the governor of New York necessarily, but our governor has gone up to Canada, right? You know, they call us and they say they need X. We set up a meeting with whomever they need to set up a meeting with. So we have accessibility. Our smallness works for us in that regard.
The second part, we represent a broad area of experience around the state. But I was at a meeting this summer of a native of Derby, or Derby line, who allowed that may be the largest expanding population area of housing, maybe even per capita than parts of Chittenden County.
Wow.
And that's right on the terminus, between Sherbrooke and 91. Yeah, are there facilities there? We know there's big holes in Newport, but how about nearer to the interstate in Derby, the Derby line?
Yeah, I think that, I can't speak to precisely in Derby, but Northern Vermont Development Association, NVDA, when we think about who would apply for this money, if we got this appropriation, we're thinking it would completely be the Northern Vermont Development Association, Franklin County Development, just because of that proximity to Canada. And people do want to be there, and they've been successful in property management before. So it probably wouldn't be a newbie who's never done it. It probably wouldn't be a smaller RDC who doesn't have the wherewithal or the board that's going to support it. A lot of things have to be in line, but I definitely see that area being much.
And we've also had testimony about Franklin County Airport, which is
Yes.
89, that they're shifting some tenants off their property.
Yes.
Have you thought?
Yes, in fact, that is a very prime area. In fact, they are one of the entities that are,
Swanton Highgate area.
they're very interested in this TIF, project-based TIF districting. They're also one of the communities that are applying for our community recovery funding for that purpose, to develop that out, extend the wastewater line, allow for more manufacturers. I think the airport properties have to be somewhat aerospace related, so it's a nice fit with the aerospace industry.
Thank you.
You had a follow-up earlier and I may have cut you off. I'm
Oh, no,
sorry.
it's okay.
Nicole.
I think you've answered this already in part, but I was just curious about the range of businesses that would occupy these new industrial spaces. And you said aerospace, manufacturing, and just that, of course, each specific business carries on its own consequences basically for the surrounding environment. And so curious about like the selection process of those
Right.
that occupy the space.
Right, so I guess what we're thinking about with this pot of money is that we may not necessarily know who the end user will be at the juncture of getting this funding, because there's so much lead time between getting a piece of property and permitting for what it might be, but we're thinking it's primarily manufacturing. So that could be food manufacturing. We're talking to somebody now, it's all about packaging and distribution of a particular food product. We're talking to a company that is wants distribution for like I don't know what you'd call it, like a down type material. So it runs the gamut. I mean, the benefit of Vermont is that we do have a diverse economy. There really isn't one particular manufacturing that is predominant. Food manufacturing is, and food processing and beverage, that is, I would say, a competitive advantage. We have human capital that's been built up over the years from the Ben and Jerry's and from the different cheese companies, what have you, beverages, the cideries, breweries, wineries, So at the time of them applying, we may not necessarily know. If they had the tenant in hand, it would be a deal that they could make at any other time. It's just that this is really so that we could create inventory, because right now we have none.
Other questions? Yeah, John.
Would a certain amount of agriculture be included in this?
Absolutely, because I've heard, I don't have a particular case right in front of me, but there's a need for storage or, I heard that a couple of years, I haven't had anybody come to me now about it, but there aren't storage facilities throughout the state enough to handle the capacity that, so some of them go outside the state. So I think we will handle whatever it is that, the RDC is in touch with the business community. What is needed? What does the community want? permitting is robust here, no matter which business you're in. So it's really about prepping this so that we could squeeze that timeline in a little bit shorter than 3 years, you know? So hopefully I've answered your question.
So the $10 million is the appropriation request one time.
Yep.
And just to, well, I'm sure it's confusing, but later this afternoon, we're going to hear from the Agency of Agriculture, which also has a $10 million request, one-time request for, I think specifically for processing. We'll find out. We can ask what the details.
Anson will be in. Mhm.
And I'm curious to know whether there, might be overlap, but this idea is to provide financing essentially not subprime, below prime, at below prime rates.
Yeah, so Vito does most of the financing. We don't do any of the lending at the agency, but think of us as having grant money that we make available for either a down payment or for the original purchase of land. What we'd like to do is once they've sold it, like Vita has great subprime financing available for commercial development for the RDCs. Once they sell it, we would want that back so that we could do this again and again and again, right? Because a lot of times they do these sub-3 deals, and when after a certain period of time, the business has the option to buy it back from the RDC, and many of them do, because they're in a better spot from when they first got this expansion, right? The cash crunch isn't as severe. So the idea would be let's get that back. Let's have, we'll have deed restrictions, whatever we need to do so that we get that, we could do it again.
So that's the idea here with this $10 million.
Yeah.
It's not out the door permanently, but it would be revolving and.
We'd want that to happen. Obviously, there probably is a long lead time. We don't know how many years, but we want that in there so that we have that option of getting it back.
So we had, I know you mentioned other requests that you might want to talk about. For anybody who saw, there was a request for $18,000 to use towards matching, I think, a federal.
For the Vermont Council.
Yeah.
The Vermont Council.
Yeah, and then last night, we got news that wouldn't be necessary, so that request is off the.
That's correct. They withdrew the request because VCRD got a congressionally directed spending earmark. They needed match, and now they found out they don't need the match, so they were just like, we withdraw it, so, yeah. And I think they're prepared to come in and talk if you wanted.
Yeah. So other things though.
One thing that might be interesting from an agricultural point of view is the Brownfields Remediation Fund. So over the last 2 years, we've asked for state money to help remediate contaminated property. And there's contaminated property all over the state. And we usually run a federal program, but the federal program has severe limitations on how much you could spend on any one remediation. And the problem with that is some of these are so severely contaminated that the limit of $500,000 from the feds is not going to cut it. And as a result, the properties lay and linger and nothing gets done, and you have pretty much valueless property. So we've been successful over the last 2 years to get these one-time appropriations. We've been funding projects all over the state. We're coming back for another $10 million ask to do that. And so, again, it just helps clear up property for a better, higher use of that value. And these could be contaminants, anything from petroleum from an old, gas station to, some more forever chemicals, dry cleaning, what have you. So we're going back, and we do that in partnership with the Agency of Natural Resources. Since they are the regulator, they will regulate and approve like what the cleanup plans are for any particular contaminated property. And then once they have the cleanup plan approved, then we are able to grant funding. And our slant on this is all about either housing or economic development purposes.
Yes, Representative Graham.
So on the brownfields, does like the municipality have to request the ability to clean that up, or how does?
It depends. So typically what happens is that there's a contaminated property, and the catalyst is usually a developer, and that could be a municipality, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a for-profit. It says, I'm willing to go through this whole procedure, and it's a procedure, right? So the state actually has a limited liability protection plan for innocent purchasers. So basically, somebody who comes in and says, I want to redevelop this, I had nothing to do with the contamination, never owned it. They could apply for this limited liability. Once they apply for that limited liability, we require all kinds of testing, monitoring, like what's in the soil, what's in the air. And then that's when they know what's in there. They figure out a redevelopment based on any given redevelopment plan, what the remediation is necessary. So for example, if you're going to pave it with a parking lot, probably not as much as if you're going to put housing on top and people are living. So the amount of cleanup is very much a function of what are you going to put on top of it. So I don't know if I answered your question. So some municipalities have gotten a hold of these properties by virtue of tax sale, right? But what you want to do is team up. The RDC would be instrumental in this. The RDC, in fact, years ago when I was in RDC in the east central part of Vermont, we worked on legislation to give an exemption to an RDC who is like a transitional owner of the property, because the RDC is eligible to apply for all this cleanup money, because the federal money is only available to nonprofits or municipalities. So, the RDC could be a good partner. They could take possession of the property, do all the limited liability, get everything cleaned up, and then could deed it back to whomever is going to do something with the property. So there are a variety of ways. I've got a team in our department as well as A&R to work together. Feel free to contact us if you have any particular property in mind. It's a great program.
What else?
The other thing that may impact is the new worker incentive. So we have a recruitment incentive. We're asking for $4 million this year. And that recruitment incentive is to pay people who are from outside of Vermont who want to move to Vermont. And how do we help repay their relocation expenses? I think it was last year, we were given the right to design a program where really what you want to do is pre-approve them before they move in. And this way it's used as an incentive, then they move in and then we reimburse them. Whereas before we used to pay people after they got here. So there was critique of that and we'll clean it up. It's still immensely popular. Like there are people from all walks of life who want to move here and it's expensive to move. So we've gotten everybody from mental health counselors to nurses to manufacturing technicians. It runs the gamut of people, and businesses like to talk about it as they're talking to and trying to recruit people from out of state. As we know, there's a workforce crunch. I mean, it's really severe. And I would think agricultural workers, the same thing.
That covers intended to cover moving expenses.
Yeah, I mean, it's primarily moving expenses. You could get up to $7,500 if you locate in a labor market area, generally outside of Chittenden County. So it's labor market areas that have higher unemployment and lower wage, and that's determined by Department of Labor. They put that out every year. And so we would want to continue in that same vein. In other words, like last year we were appropriated $3 million, and the amount of applications we have in queue will more than eat up that $3 million. So just got to build the housing.
Yeah.
We're working on all of it at once, right? Nothing in a silo.
And you'll be meeting with other committees.
I imagine. I mean, we're in House appropriations tomorrow morning, I think. So normally we would, I think they would want the opinion of the different policy committees, and House Commerce, I would think, would weigh in as well. That's normally where I spend most of my time, but it's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Any other questions about those requests? The new worker incentive program, that's not in there isn't a base budget amount for that. So it's
No.
every year.
Every year it's been like just, one time money. Yeah.
David, my only comment about the new worker incentive program is we have such a housing crisis existing now for workers, families that are here. I think we're putting the cart before the horse as far as, especially some of these non-Chittenden County areas. I think housing is a crisis that we as a body need to address.
Yes.
For that, but
Yeah, I know that there is a pretty comprehensive bill working its way on housing, not just funding, but some permitting accommodations so that we can get the housing built. It isn't just the money, it's the money and the structure, the robust structure that we have to get something built. And we're working on that at the same time. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's the type of situation we're never going to be there at a certain point and say, okay, now we're ready to recruit. I feel like we have to work on it all at once, recruitment, job creation, to have a robust economy and build out of housing.
for instance, even in Lamoille County, they're big employers, let's say Copley Hospitals.
Yes.
You know, they've got all sorts of talented folks that want to come and they can't provide housing, so they don't come, or the hospital is now renting or buying property to house new physicians or nurses.
It's happened in the southwestern part of the state as well, with Southwestern Medical, getting involved in housing, really everywhere,
Yeah, I realize.
Okay, thank you for
Well, thank you very much.
stopping by.
Thank you.
So the afternoon of today, it's the afternoon, I've got a couple more budget presentations. From at 1 o'clock, the Agency of Agriculture is scheduled to be here. So I imagine that might be a full hour, so we should probably try and get started right at 1. And then we're gonna have Ellen Kaler back in from the Sustainable Jobs Fund with a specific funding request. Then we've got a half hour slated, which may be a little longer. I'm not sure that Ellen will need 30 minutes, but we've got then the rest of that hour to return to the conversation about the bill that we've been walking through. And I've asked Beth to come back and Rosie if she can join us from the agency. And maybe we should ask Julia too, if she's available and wants to be here, because I know there's a couple of questions that are numbers that maybe we should try and put to them directly. And maybe I'll try and connect with them between now and then too. And if they can't be here, we can get some answers anyway. But yeah, I mean, well, we've got 5 minutes. Anybody have any thoughts or, yeah, John?
So why did
Yeah.
this commissioner come in?
Oh. Well, we invited her and each policy committee gets a list of budget items that the appropriations committee has asked us to comment on. And this $10 million project was on that list. And I'm not sure, I didn't ask that question, but I imagine it's because the projects could involve food processing. Sounds like maybe they got something in the works. So in that sense, I think they're just hoping to get reactions from as many different committees as possible. Yeah, it's hard to, we don't have a whole lot of context for saying, oh, that's a great idea, or no, I'd rather that, that commerce agency used, or department used the money for something else. It's still challenging, but I think maybe it's just helpful to, at least for us to know. And then there was a request that was more specific to us, the Council on Rural Development funding, which was, somebody else was going to be here from the agency too, so.
But these asks are in the governor's budget as one time.
Yes, yeah, we may also have some that are not one time. But yes, I think generally that's what, otherwise, if they're recurring, I'm not sure that they do go to the policy committees necessarily. which doesn't mean that we can't say anything we want. I mean, we can certainly offer recommendations for changing, base amounts or in one direction or the other.
And it could be included in our memo to appropriations.
Yeah. Anything else? Take the lunch break? Okay.
We want to